You're joining from home. Hopefully you have a Tanakh or a Chumash in front of you. We are looking at today the Torah portion of Tzav, which is the second Torah portion in the book of Leviticus. Got some great material to get into today, so bear with me. If you're new to the class, you've got to stick it out. You can't say, I listened for 10 minutes and I don't quite get it. Stick with it. It's going to come through, and at the end, you'll see. It'll be well worth your time. So try to bear down and see if you can follow along. Go very slowly. We'll explain everything so that everyone understands. And of course, if you don't, or if you have any questions, send me a text 239-220-8890. If you want to just send me a text with a thumbs up or you're doing great, whatever. I mean, anything like that. You know what to say. I don't need to tell you. That would be appreciated as well. Let's begin with our blessing for the study of Torah before we get into Parashat Tzav, the second Torah portion of the book of Leviticus. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, so two things you need in front of you. First thing is if you have the Torah portion in front of you, any kind of Chumash, any kind of Tanakh, any kind of Bible. Well, not any kind of Bible, but the Jewish one. That would be good. We're in Leviticus chapter 8 today. So we're going to look at chapter 8. Again, we're in the third triennial cycle. So all this year we're looking at the last third of each Torah portion. And this week we're going to be in chapter 8 of Leviticus. If you don't have a Torah at home, you can Google it online. I recommend Sefaria, Sefaria.org. You can go there. It has the entire Bible. And you can click on Leviticus and scroll to chapter 8. Once you have your Bible in front of you, or your Chumash in front of you, please, the study sheet you can find, the sources for this class you can find on the web at tbam.org/worksheet. Same place we've been the last couple of weeks, www.tbam.org/worksheet. Very thankful to Neil Littauer, who's been working like a dog to make sure that everything is updated for all the things that we're doing virtually. He's like our virtual executive director, and it's exhausting. But he's got it up there. It's there. I'm looking at it right now on my laptop, www.tbam.org/worksheet. So if you have your Chumash and you have your tbam.org/worksheet, we'll be ready to go. Amazing to see how many people are with us this morning. And it's really nice. We get a lot more people when we go virtual than we do in the morning. Although I'll tell you, I don't want you to not start coming back to the chapel once we are back in the temple eventually. But we always stream this online. You can always watch it if you're someone who's at home and you can't, for whatever reason, you just can't get to the temple at 9 a.m. You can always watch this class online. And if you would like, you can go on our website and watch the last 70 or 80 of these. So if you want, you don't just have the live at noon with Rabbi Barras that you can binge watch. If you've missed any episodes over the last 2 weeks, you can go back and binge watch them. But you can binge watch these Torah studies. You could learn the whole Torah in the next few days if you want to. So here we go. I'm going to begin with chapter 8. And towards the end of chapter 8, let's start with verse 22. Chapter 8 of Leviticus, verse 22. Okay? So flip in chapter 8 of Leviticus to verse 22. Okay. Chapter 8 of Leviticus, verse 22. Now the end of the chapter, or really this whole chapter, is an event. It's a very important event. And it's what's known as the Miluim. Now, not the word Miluim that you might be familiar with if you know anything about Israeli society and the Israeli army. Miluim is what they call reserve duty in the Israeli army. Miluim, but this Miluim is actually spelled differently, and it means something different. What it means here is inauguration. And so what we have here is the inauguration of the priesthood. And once we learn about the inauguration of the priesthood and how this works, you're going to see dramatically how this relates to what's going on today. And we've noticed over the last couple of weeks that the Torah portions seem to be playing out with what's going on in our world. And I think it happens again this week in a very dramatic way, but not till the very end of the Torah portion. So I'll just start reading through verse 22 through the end of the Torah portion. And I'll go slowly and I'll explain what needs to be explained. But really what we're seeing here, and we don't really need to explain too much until we get to the very end for our purposes this morning. But what we see here is that there is this service that needs to be done to inaugurate the priests to be able to officially be the priesthood who's going to work in the Mishkan, who's going to work in the tabernacle. And this is the inauguration for all time. This is an inauguration that's not just for the priesthood then, but even through to today. So what do I mean by that? Once the Holy Temple was built, the priesthood, they'd been inaugurated that they could now go and work in the Holy Temple and they could do all the jobs that the priests needed to do, and there were a lot of them. Most of them involved the sacrificial cult, but there were a lot of them. So today, what does it mean to be a priest today? You know, in Reform Judaism, we don't really have it. I mean, people know who's a Kohen. Anyone whose last name is Cohen or anything like that. Khan, Kahan, any name like that, you know they're from the Kohens. But we don't have in Reform Judaism like they do in Orthodox and Conservative where the Kohen, the priest, gets the first aliyah. And then a Levite gets the second aliyah, and then Israelites, everyone else, can have the rest of the aliyahs. We don't do that because Reform Judaism made an effort to get rid of the caste system to show that all of us are equal. But even in traditional Judaism, there is a role for the Kohen today. So, for example, you might see if someone's a Kohen, they're not supposed to go into a cemetery unless it's an actual very, very close nuclear family relative. So why aren't they allowed to go into the priesthood? They're not allowed to go into a cemetery. They're not allowed to go into a cemetery because they'll become impure. And there's no way to purify yourself from impurity of what's called tumat hamet, impurity of death, without having... The only way to do that, to purify yourself from that, is to get a red heifer, to sacrifice it, to burn it, to take its ashes, to mix it with water, to go to a special place in the Holy Temple and dump it over your head. But we don't have a Holy Temple anymore. We don't have sacrifice, so you can't do that. So priests have to be very careful not to become impure. Because what happens if they're impure? If all the priests today became impure, and the Messiah would come, and the Holy Temple would be rebuilt, and the only people... We're not going to have to build it. God's just going to bring it down. And the only people who are allowed in there to actually do the sacrifices are the priests. But they're all impure because they've all been in cemeteries. Then they can't go in there. And no one's going to be able to do the sacrifices. So priests today, they have to be pure just in case the Messiah is going to come on their watch while they're alive and someone's going to need to go into the Holy Temple and do the work. I don't know how many Reform Jews that resonates with, which is probably part of the reason why Reform Judaism isn't so worried about the priesthood. But it's a thing. And this week's Torah portion was the very beginning of when it all started. So again, it's not such a big deal today, although theoretically it is. But practically, it was a much bigger deal in the wilderness, of course. And then once they got to Israel, and they started to have sacrifices. And then, of course, once King Solomon built the first temple, and you have the first temple period and the second temple period, you need a priesthood. Well, you can't be a priest until the concept of the priesthood is inaugurated. And that's what this Torah portion is all about. Okay? And if it's not done right, if the priests at that time didn't do it right, Aaron and his sons, the only way to be a priest, a Kohen, is to be a direct descendant, a male on the male side of Aaron. So Aaron and his sons, if they don't do it right, the whole system that God has set up of how to communicate with God, how to atone for sins, how to celebrate holidays, none of it can happen because there's nobody who could administer the priesthood. So what does it take to be inaugurated? You don't have to worry about it. No one's ever going to inaugurate. Well, if you're a priest, you might want to raise your hand in this class. If you're a Kohen, and say, maybe somebody should get me ready, because if the Messiah comes, I want to be one of those guys who works in the Holy Temple. And if you are, you're going to get a really cool apartment in the old city of Jerusalem. So it's not all bad, and that's going to be really nice. All right, so here we go. That was a long-winded introduction. So I want to start now, chapter 8, verse 22. Everybody got it? I have no idea if you do or not, but here we go. Okay, verse 22. Now my translation may be a little bit different than yours, but bear with me. Verse 22, Leviticus chapter 8. Then he brought near the second ram, the inauguration ram, and Aaron and his sons leaned their hands upon the head of the ram. He slaughtered it, and Moses took some of its blood and placed it upon the middle part of Aaron's right ear, upon the thumb of his right hand, and upon the big toe of his right foot. He brought the sons of Aaron forward, and Moses put some of the blood upon the middle part of the right ear, upon the thumb of the right ear, and upon the big toe of the right ear. And Moses threw the remaining blood upon the altar all around. So what we see here is Moses was not a priest, but he was a priest. Because in order to be a priest, you need in order to inaugurate other priests, you need to be a priest. But Moses wasn't a priest. How could he inaugurate Aaron and his sons? So the rabbis explain that for a moment he was the priest. And he served as the priest because he's basically been inaugurated by God to do this through his different experiences, through spending 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai and seeing the backside of God and talking to God face to face. He's able to do this. So Moses comes and serves as the high priest and inaugurates the priests. But once he inaugurates the priests and the high priest, he can't have more than one high priest at once. So at the moment that he inaugurates the high priest as Aaron, and Aaron becomes the high priest, then Moses is no longer the high priest, and Moses goes back to being a Levite. Remember, Moses and his brother, they're from the tribe of Levite. So Aaron is a Levite. If you ask him, what tribe are you from? He says, I'm a Levite. But if you ask him, what's your status in the Jewish community? I'm a priest. So you could be a Kohen and a Levite, but if you're a Kohen and a Levite, you take the higher term, which means Kohen. So Moses was briefly a Kohen until he inaugurates Aaron. Then he goes back to being a Levite. Okay, clear stuff. So this is what's going on, and I want to skip now, but we don't have to go through all the blood and all the different things that they do. You can read through that on your own, but I want to skip now to the end, at least towards the end. So if you skip with me to verse 30, we'll just skip a little bit to verse 30. Moses took from the oil of anointment and some of the blood that was on the altar, and he sprinkled it upon Aaron and his vestments, and upon his sons, and upon the vestments of his sons who were with him. Then he sanctified Aaron and his vestments, and his sons, and the vestments of his sons with him. So we see the importance of the clothes, that the sanctification of the begadim, the clothes that the holy priests were wearing, they play a very special role. We could do the whole hour just on their clothes, but maybe we'll do that in 3 years. We're not going to get back to this portion, this section of it, till we get to the third triennial cycle in a few years, but that gives us something to look forward to in 3 years. So we got that going for us, which is nice. Okay, verse 31. Moses said to Aaron and to his sons, cook the flesh at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and there you shall eat it, and the bread that is in the basket of the inauguration offerings, as I have commanded, saying, Aaron and his sons shall eat it. Okay, so once they make the sacrifice, it's not effectuated until a priest eats from the sacrifice. Well, who's the priest? It's now Aaron and his sons, so they have to eat part of the animals that they sacrificed. And whatever is left over of the flesh of the bread, you shall burn it in the fire. Now, there's reasons for all of these things. I'm not going to get into all of them. This is a whole course to talk about the reasons for all of these things. I'm trying to go to a certain place with this today. You shall not leave the entrance of the tent of meeting for... Okay, so this is a section you might want to underline. We're pretty much now at the end of the Torah portion. And I want to focus almost the entirety of the rest of our time on verses 33 through 36. Okay, so I want to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about 4 verses because these verses are very fascinating. And if you have the worksheet in front of you, we're going to refer to that in a minute. So if you're just joining us, we're dealing with the Torah portion of Tzav, and the source sheet for what we're going to look at now is on the web, www.tbam.org/worksheet. So you're going to need the sources there, tbam.org/worksheet. Okay, but before we get to the sources, let's look at these last 4 verses. Now, verse 33 is one to underline. Here's the crux of everything I want to talk about. So what we have so far, before we look at verse 33, Moses is inaugurating Aaron and his sons to be the priests. Okay, everybody have that so far? Surprised nobody's texted me a thumbs up or any. I mean, usually I get some of those. They're appreciated, but hopefully we're clear so far. If you're watching on Facebook and you want to give me a thumbs up that you're clear so far, that would be helpful. It's one of the problems with doing this virtually instead of being in the class. I can't make sure we're all on the same page, but hopefully you're on this page with me so far. We haven't said that much. All we've said so much is that we have, there come the thumbs up. Thank you very much. What we have so far is the inauguration. Now, as the inauguration is being completed, look at verse 33. This is amazing. Okay, you might read it and say, this isn't amazing. What's a big deal? But look at it. 33. You shall not leave the entrance of the tent of meeting for 7 days until the day when your inauguration are completed. For you shall be inaugurated for a 7-day period. Okay. They have to stay there for 7 days. Now, why do they have to stay there for 7 days? Let's just finish the Torah portion and then we're going to come back to that question. Why? What do they have to stay there for 7 days for? Why not 6 days? Why not 8 days? Why not 12 days? Why not 1 day? Why not an hour? Why at all? Why do the priests have to stay there for 7 days? Okay. And what are the consequences if they don't? I mean, what could happen here? What's going on? As he did on this, so verse 33 one more time. You shall not leave the entrance of the tent of meeting for 7 days until the day when your days of inauguration are completed, for you shall be inaugurated for a 7-day period. So one of the things that we see right there is if you leave during the course of the 7 days, you're not going to be inaugurated. It won't work. It takes 7 days for the inauguration to take. Okay. And so they can't leave the tent of meeting. As he did on this day, so God had commanded to be done to atone for you. Atone for what? What are we atoning for? At the entrance of the tent of meeting shall you dwell. Now look at this. Day and night for a 7-day period. And you shall protect God's charge so that you will not die. For so have I been commanded. And Aaron and his sons carried out all the matters that God commanded through Moses. Okay. So what we see here is Aaron and his sons are commanded to stay in the tent of meeting for 7 days. And if they don't stay for 7 days, they'll die. Not only will they not become priests, but they'll die. How do I know that? Look at verse 35 one more time. At the entrance of the tent of meeting shall you dwell day and night for a 7-day period. Okay, fine. And if we look at it in Hebrew, Ufetach ohel moed, at the opening to the tent of meeting, or at the entrance to the tent of meeting, Teshvu yomam v'layla, you shall dwell day and night, Shivat yamim, 7 days, Ushmartem et mishmeret Hashem, and you shall protect God's charge, Velo tamutu, so that you don't die. And then it says, for so I have been commanded, and then it says they did it. So sometimes it's easier to get someone to do something when if they don't do it, they'll die. So they say, you know what? Let's go, maybe they had such a conversation. Hey, anybody want to go for a walk? Anyone want to go out of the tent of meeting? Well, if we do, we'll die. All right, I changed my mind. Maybe we should just stay here. Okay. What is this? Why? So what does it mean now to stay at the entrance of the tent of meeting? Well, the rabbis were very curious about this Because if you had to use the restroom, you weren't allowed to do it in the tent of meeting. But if you go outside of the tent of meeting, you die. So does this mean they didn't use the restroom for 7 days? Now, only the rabbis would ask such an important question. How'd they use the restroom? So, we see in other places in the Torah that people do something for a certain period of time. One of the things is when Moses dies, or when Jacob dies. There are these extended periods of mourning. And it says the people cried. So does that mean that for 30 days, this extended period of mourning, they cried the whole time? That literally for 30 days straight they cried? Nobody ever slept, nobody ever ate. They just cried the whole time for 30 days? So no, it doesn't mean that. It means that they were sad for 30 days and they were a period of mourning. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they didn't, but it was a sad period. So the rabbis say, look, one of the rabbis says a miracle happened and they were, able to, there was like this bridge that they went on that just came about and there was a restroom at the other end and so forth. But I think what the rabbi says, look, when they had to go out to the restroom, they went out to the restroom. What's the big deal? But then they came back. But the idea is that whenever they needed to, whenever they could at all possible be in the tent of meeting, for the overwhelming majority of that 7-day period, they were there. But yes, they went out once in a while to use the restroom, check the scores, I don't know, there was not very good Wi-Fi reception in the tent of meetings. They went out to check their email, they went out, whatever, but then they came right back. All right, that was a joke. They didn't really have email back then, although they did have the Urim and Tumim, which lit up. That was really the first email system anyway. That's a biblical joke, and if you get it, that's pretty impressive. Okay, now, what is this idea, first of all, that they need to be there for a 7-day period? Why do they need to be there for a 7-day period? What's the point? So, one of the things we know right off the bat is that 7 is a holy number. Okay, but before we get into that, I want to look at an idea from the Talmud, which is the first source on the worksheet. So again, if you look with me, I have it on my laptop here, www.tbam.org/worksheet, the first source on the page. So the first source on the page says this. This is from the Talmud, from the tractate of Yoma, the very beginning of Yoma. Yoma is a fascinating tractate. It's one of my favorite ones I've ever studied. And in Yoma, it talks a lot about the priesthood and how they went about their business in the Holy Temple. So it starts off, Yoma is all about Yom Kippur. But Yom Kippur in biblical times and in temple times was a holiday that had a lot to do with the sacrifices of atonement. So a lot of the tractate of Yoma talks about this. So here's how it begins. This is the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Yoma, the very beginning, 2a. By the way, in any tractate, there is no page 1. Every tractate starts on page 2. So 2a is pretty much the very beginning of the tractate. So here's what the Mishnah says there. 7 days prior, hopefully you're reading along with me on the worksheet, tbam.org/worksheet. Okay, one word, worksheet. 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. Look, so here we have already another time where the priesthood had to be segregated for 7 days. Okay? 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, the sages would remove the high priest, who performs the entire Yom Kippur service, from his house to the chamber of the Parhedron, a room in the temple designated specifically for the high priest during that period. So what was the Parhedron? The Parhedron was they had like a little apartment for the high priest to use the week before Yom Kippur. Actually, I think every temple should have one of these, like a little temple that, at least that the senior rabbi could go to. If you're there really late one day and you have to be there early the next morning, it's something to think about. I don't know, we don't need to get into that right away, but they had a chamber, which was called the Parhedron, that was an apartment where the high priest could go, and he would be alone there for 7 days, nobody would come into contact with him unless he needed something, and then one of the other priests could help him. But he would be alone there, and that way he could be segregated for 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. So what we see here so far is that before the priest could be inaugurated, they needed to have a 7-day period of segregation. And here also, that's not the only time. There was another time where they needed, and that happened every year, right before Yom Kippur, the high priest needed to be segregated. We know that from the Mishnah. Here's what it says. And they would designate another priest in his stead to replace him, lest a disqualification due to impurity or another circumstance beyond his control prevent him from entering the temple on Yom Kippur. So in other words, what would happen? This is an amazing idea that comes out in the Talmud. This is an amazing idea that comes out in the Talmud. 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, in order to become purified, let's say the high priest became impure. Say he stepped on a snake or bumped into someone who was impure, whatever. In order for him to become purified, he would have to then wait 7 days and then go to the mikveh. And then he could become purified. So let's say he's walking around town on day 3. And on day 3, he becomes impure, 3 days before, or 3 days before Yom Kippur, or 4 days before Yom Kippur, within a week before Yom Kippur, and he becomes impure. And now, Yom Kippur comes, and he's still impure because his 7 days of waiting before he could go to the mikveh to purify himself have come along. Then Yom Kippur comes, he can't go into the holy temple. Well, if he can't go into the holy temple, he can't offer the sacrifice that atones for all of the people's sins, and all of the Jews that year aren't going to get atonement because everybody relied on that. Now we don't have this anymore. Now we have only our own prayers. But back then, everyone needed the sacrifice of the high priest to atone for their sins. And if he can't go in there and no one else is allowed in there, then we have a problem. So let's say, by the way, during those 7 days of segregation, where you keep him totally secure so that he can't become impure and he'll be ready to go in, say he dies in those 6, over the course of those 7 days. And his son now becomes the high priest. But his son hasn't been segregated because he knew his dad was going to take care of it. So now nobody can go in because he became impure because he's out and about. So what do you do? You segregate the son too. So now the father and the son are both segregated. Someone writes in a question about his wife, right? There are a lot of different interesting facets of this. I don't have time to get into all of it. But let's say the son dies. So then you got to segregate the grandson. Or if there is no grandson, then whoever the next, high priest would have been, maybe it's a nephew or whatever. So now you got to segregate so the Talmud says, don't worry about the third guy. They say there's a limit because what if the third guy dies? Then you got to segregate the fourth in line and the fifth. The Talmud says, look, the second guy and the first guy aren't both going to die. One of them's going to make it through the week. Don't worry, they're not both going to die. And so they would just segregate. They just segregate both. I just realized I'm using a lot of electricity for whatever reason on the Facebook page. So there's a chance that the iPad that I'm using for Facebook may go out. I may lose you if you're watching on Facebook. So if you're watching on Facebook, you might want to switch over to tbam.org. I thought I charged this thing up. Apparently it's not. However, my iPad for tbam.org/streaming is full force. So if you're watching on Facebook and you can't get enough of this, you're just loving it, and you don't want to miss out, switch over to tbam.org/streaming. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's go on. Source number 1, the second paragraph. Back to the worksheet. The sages say in response, derived from a verbal analogy between the terms commanded and commanded. In other words, the word commanded in Hebrew in the Torah is used in 2 different places in the exact same way. One, okay, you'll see what I mean. So with regards to the inauguration, the Lord commanded to do as it is stated with regard to the red heifer. This is the statute of Torah that the Lord commanded, saying, just as the term commanded there refers to heifer, so too here the phrase the Lord commanded to do, written in the context of the days of inauguration, refers to the heifer. And just as here with regard to the inauguration, there is the principle of sequestering prior to performing the service, so too there, in the context of the halachot of the heifer, sequestering is required prior to performance of the mitzvah. So a good question you might ask is, what in the world are you talking about? What does that mean? The Talmud does this sometimes. And what it says is, this is called a gezerah shava. You can learn a principle when two words are used in the same in different places. And you can learn the same principle. So what they're saying is, whereas before Yom Kippur, you sequester the high priest so that he can offer the sacrifice on behalf of everybody, you also sequester him before he would offer the red heifer, because that was a 7-day thing also. And here as well, during the inauguration, the priesthood need to be sequestered. The priesthood need to be sequestered 7 days before the inauguration can become final. Okay, everybody clear so far? So there's this idea of being sequestered so that you remain, one reason so that you remain pure. I mean, that's the most important on Yom Kippur. But the other idea is for the whole thing to take effect, for the whole thing to work, you have to remain sequestered for 7-day period. Why 7 days? What is so we know on the occasion of Yom Kippur that Yom Kippur comes, and if you're not ready, then you miss it and you didn't atone for everybody. But let's say one of the priests would go out from his tent in our story here in Parashat Tzav, so start over. There's no Yom Kippur that's coming and says, this is the day you have to do it, so you can start over. One guy became impure, all right, we'll start over. I mean, it'd be annoying, but it's not the end of the world. Let's just start over. We'll wait another 7 days now. And we'll do the inauguration next week. I mean, that would be annoying, but it could happen. So what I'm saying is the reason that they had to, in our Torah portion now, wait 7 days is not because they were worried that something was going to happen on one specific day necessarily. There's another reason. And we haven't yet pointed out to the reason of what it is that they had to wait 7 days for. Now, there's a hint in the name of next week's Torah portion. So next week's Torah portion is Shmini. What is Shmini? Let's look now at the first verse of next week's Torah portion. So, chapter 9 of Leviticus, verse 1. Chapter 9 of Leviticus, verse 1. Vayihi bayom hashmini kara Moshe laharon levanav lezignei Yisrael. It was on the 8th day Moses called to Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. And now they're going to go out and bring the sacrifices, and the inauguration is going to be complete. On what day? The 8th day. Next week's Torah portion is called Shmini because it happens on the 8th day. Why does it happen on the 8th day? Because they had to have 7 days of being sequestered. So after the 7 days of being sequestered, if you can do this kind of math in your head, the next day after 7 days is the 8th day. Right? 7 plus 1? 8. Okay, so now on the 8th day, something has been completed. That 7-day period has been completed. The 8th day, they're now available to go out and have the inauguration be completed and become the high priest. Okay, think in Jewish tradition. When else do we do things? On the 8th day. What's another time that we do something on the 8th day? This should be pretty easy. There's one very specific thing that we do on the 8th day. And doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Why does it have to be the 8th day? Why not the 7th day? Why not the 9th day? What's the 8th day? Okay. So, the answer is circumcision. Right? Whenever we have a bris, Rita Diaz coming in on Facebook with the answer. very few people in our community have the kind of Talmudic insight that Rita brings to Temple Beth Am on a daily basis. Way to go, Rita. Okay. What is it about the eighth day? Okay, so I want to explain this in Hasidic terms a little bit. And there's a rabbi who wrote a beautiful idea on this. A rabbi from the 20th century who was born around 1911 and who died, I think, in 2000, who was known as the Slonimer Rebbe. The Slonimer Rebbe, he was born in Belarus, although he eventually made Aliyah. And he wrote a beautiful commentary on the Torah using Hasidic thought called Netivot Shalom, or you may know it as Nesivas Shalom. So a couple of people typing in Brit Milah, of course. Also Shmini Atzeret, right? The final day of the Sukkot holiday is Shmini Atzeret. So we hear this word Shmini, the eighth day, a couple of times. And what the Slonimer Rebbe explains, and we're going to look at, if you look at the source sheet, you can see the last sheet is Netivot Shalom. We're going to look at, again, it's tbam.org/streaming if you want to look at the worksheet. But we're going to look at some ideas from the Slonimer Rebbe on this in a minute to try and understand what's going on here. Why 8 days? Why does a bris have to be on the 8th day? You know, if you have a baby boy whose 8th day is on Yom Kippur, even on Yom Kippur, you would still do the bris. In fact, you're commanded to do the bris, unless it's a C-section. If it's C-section, you actually have different rules. But if it goes through the womb like it's supposed to, what's called Peter Rechem in Judaism, then you have a bris even on Yom Kippur. So, why the 8th day? So the Slonimer Rebbe explains that what's the holiest day of the year? The holiest day of the year, the rabbis dispute that in the Talmud, although the answer is Shabbat. But I meant to say, what's the holiest day of the week? The holiest day of the week is Shabbat. And there's a koach, there's a power to Shabbos that you need to be infused with in order to achieve your highest spiritual self. Until you've celebrated at least one Shabbos, your soul, not so much your body. I mean, babies in their first week of life are not, davening 3 times, davening and going to shul. They're not doing anything. But their soul is. Their soul experiences that first week of life. They're really connecting with the concept of the week of creation, the beginning of the Torah, and they need to have that first Shabbos, because that first Shabbos really infuses them with something. So whenever you have to wait a full 7-day period, the reason is to guarantee that you've covered at least one Shabbos. Because if you're impure, you can't become totally purified for certain things until you've had a 7-day period and you've established at least one Shabbos. So the Torah says the only way to guarantee that you're going to have at least one Shabbos in a given period, because it only happens once every 7 days, is to wait a 7-day period. And so there's something special about the priesthood being inaugurated that they couldn't do it until they experienced a Shabbos. Okay? Now, what is it about Shabbos that requires sequestration? That requires, now, here I'm going to tip my hand a little bit towards what we're talking about. But let me go back to verse 33 one more time. And then we're going to get an idea of what we're talking about in the last 19 minutes or so. But so far what we've said is this. I'm going to tip my hand in verse 33, so don't go anywhere. This is about to get really good. In order to get to where we're going, we had to explain everything that we've explained so far. But this is about to get really good. So don't go anywhere. Are you crazy? How could you leave now? Right? Okay. So what we've said so far is that the 7-day period requires that you pass over one Shabbat. Because there's something inherent about the holiness of Shabbat that you need to be infused with. And we need to guarantee that you're infused with that. And really a 7-day period so that you get the essence of each day of Ma'aseh Bereshit, each day of what God did during the first week of creation, but most importantly, the first Shabbat. Okay, so now look at verse 33 again. You shall not leave the entrance of the tent of meeting for 7 days until the day when your days of inauguration are completed, for you shall be inaugurated for a 7-day period. And then we see in verse 35 that if you go out, you could die. Now, Rashi says on verse 35, I didn't bring this source, but Rashi says they're not really going to die. Look what Rashi says, that when the Torah says velo tamutu, so that you will not die, what it really means is, but if you do not do so, you are worthy of death. Meaning, if you don't stay at the entrance of the tent of meeting for all 7 days, you're not going to die. But it's like you should die. It's like you did something so bad that, and what it really means is that you will have lost your purpose in life because you haven't fulfilled this mission. And so it'll be like you're dead because your mission in life, you're not doing it. And the Torah equates that to it's like not even being living because you're here to do something and now you're not doing it. Okay, so now I'm going to tip my hand a little bit. What am I talking about? Think about what's going on in our Torah portion this week. The priesthood is being quarantined. The priesthood is being quarantined. The priesthood is saying, or the Torah is saying, from God through Moses to the priest, if you go out, you're a danger to other people. If you leave now and you come into contact with other people, you're a danger to other people. That's in this week's Torah portion. Does it sound familiar? Right? Where are we right now? Why do we have to stay at home? To flatten the curve, right? So we don't endanger other people. That's in this week's Torah portion. That's in this week's Torah portion. The priests are being told, you need to quarantine. You need to stay at home. Pretty incredible. Okay, so now let's try to understand. Let's look at one more place in the Talmud to try to understand why. We know today why we need to quarantine. Because we don't want to get each other sick, right? And you could be asymptomatic and have the virus and spread it to millions of people, potentially, right? We understand that. So now what I want to explain though is, what was the danger of the priests? What are they going to do to hurt anybody? We could see that maybe they would become impure, but how are they going to hurt other people? Okay, so look now at the second source on the sheet from the Talmud, from the tractate of Ketubot. Again, from the Babylonian Talmud, page 103b, towards the end of the tractate of Ketubot, another fascinating tractate. And there's a line here. Now, what they're talking about is people dying. And what they're saying about people dying is you could die at a lot of different times. And there's sometimes that when you actually die, it's like a good sign. Like if you die on Yom Kippur or something, right? But it mentions that what happens if you die on Friday night, on the eve of Shabbat, or right before Shabbat starts. So if you look at source 2, we're not going to read the whole thing, but if you look at source 2, again, we're on tbam.org/streaming. If you've stuck with us on Facebook, I've got 10% left, but now I have 5% left. Maybe we'll make it. I don't know. If we're on Facebook, I got 5% left. You might want to, you're not going to want to miss the end of this. So you may want to switch off to tbam.org/streaming, where I got full power. Okay, so here's what it says at the end of source 2. So look with me, tbam.org/worksheet, source 2, the Talmud, Ketubot, page 103b. It says, if one dies on Shabbat Eve, right? If someone dies on Erev Shabbos, it is a good sign for him. The Talmud says, Siman Tov, or Siman Yafeh. He is heading straight into the Sabbath rest. For if one dies at the conclusion of Shabbat, it's a bad sign for him. So in other words, it's better to die Friday night than Saturday night. If you die Friday night, you die at the entrance of Shabbat. Now look, if you know someone who died on Saturday night, it's not a big deal. But what they're saying is, I mean, you could die at any time. People die at any time, no big deal. But what the Talmud is saying is there's something inherently powerful. There's something inherently powerful about Erev Shabbat. And if you die on Erev Shabbat, that one time compared to any other time of the week, then there's like a blessing in that. Okay? So what is it? There's something that happens on Shabbat that doesn't happen any other time. Shabbat is, and on Friday night, there's this moment where Shabbat starts, where you go from being not in Shabbat to being in Shabbat. There's a transformation that we make. And what is that transformation? I mean, what is Shabbat? Shabbat is mainly about not what you do, but what you don't do. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. 39 different categories of work you're not supposed to do. Shabbat is about don't do it. Right? I mean, there are things that we do. Of course, there are things that we do. But there's a lot more things that we don't do. And Shabbat is about a period of not doing things, of not working, of being at a state of rest. So what does it mean to be at a state of rest? It means to not do things. Now, does that mean you have to sleep the whole day? No, of course not. What is it? Why do we rest? What are we trying to accomplish with our Shabbat rest? And if you die right at that moment, you die at the height of moving in from being in this non-Shabbat mode to being into that Shabbat mode. Okay, so if you look now, Kabbalah really explains this. And this Hasidic idea of the Netivat Shalom that the Slonimer Rebbe brought to us is what I want to share with you. So if you look now at the third source on the sheet, there are 3 comments here. I want to look at the third one first. So if you look at the third comment first of the Netivat Shalom, or the Nesivas Shalom if you're Ashkenazic, we look at the third comment first, then we'll go back and look at the first 2, and hopefully it'll make sense. So what we're trying to figure out now is, why is it that the priests need to be sequestered for 7 days, and if they're not, they'll go out. If they go out, they'll die. And why is it that the miluim can only take place on the 8th day? So we've said they've got to have at least one Shabbat. And then we see next week's Torah portion on Shmini, we've had the 7th-day period. Now the 8th day, they've had that Shabbat. They're able to be inaugurated. Okay, fine. But why? Why is it that they need that Shabbat? So let's take a look. The Netivat Shalom, again, this is a 20th century Hasidic work from the Slonimer Rebbe, who was born in Belarus and who died after he made Aliyah in Israel. So look at, he didn't write a number. I just took 3 excerpts from it, and I numbered it excerpt 1, excerpt 2, and excerpt 3. This is from his commentary on the Torah portion of Tzav, the Slonimer Rebbe. So here's what he says, Nesivas Shalom, excerpt 3, again on tbam.org/worksheet, the very last source. Here's what it says. A Jew who wants to be called holy, okay, if you want to reach the pinnacle of Kadosh, begins with Shabbat, as this is the beginning of being called to holiness. On Shabbat, a Jew is able to nullify himself completely before God. So what is Shabbat rest? Shabbat rest, this is what the Kabbalists would call self-nullification. There's a really good book on this by Daniel Matt. I think it's called, forget what it's called, God and Kabbalah, or, no, it's called Torah and the Big Bang, or something like that. The Big Bang and God, something like that. But it's a really nice book in which he explains this idea of what Kabbalah is what it means by the self-nullification. So on Shabbat, by disengaging from work, what we're really trying to do is also to disengage from all of those qualities of ourself that we don't like, right? The bad things. We disengage from going after money. We disengage from competition with other people. We disengage primarily from our own arrogance. We disengage from seeing the world focused around us, as instead to the world focused around God. We disengage from seeing ourselves as if the whole world was created for us and moving over to the idea of we are but dust and ashes. So there's this concept of self-nullification, of purifying yourself, making yourself a holy vessel that isn't crowded by any of the things in life that can impurify your soul. And the high priest needed a whole week of that, to be alone, to think about that before they could become inaugurated. So the Slonimer Rebbe then quotes another famous Hasidic Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who was known as the Kedushas Levi. So the Kedushas Levi, he quotes him, he says, the Kedushas Levi taught regarding Rosh Hashanah that it is known that Yom Kippur does not atone until an individual nullifies himself completely before God. So we don't become on Yom Kippur, even with all our prayers. You could say all the prayers and be in all of the services and fast and everything. But why do we do that on Yom Kippur? Why do we afflict our souls? Why do we fast? Why do we not anoint ourselves? Why do we do all these things? To achieve the most spiritual state possible, to be like the angels for a day. And to be like the angels means to nullify every human aspiration, right? Greed, arrogance, all of these things. Okay? To bring about holiness. Let's look at now, if you understand that concept, and I hope you do. I wish we were all in a room together so I could see you shaking your head, I understand. But that's the goal of the 7-day period. To pass through Shabbat so that you've experienced Shabbat to give you that feeling of self-nullification. Not that you're putting yourself down. We're not putting ourselves down. Self-nullification in this sense means that I've gotten rid of all my negative traits and I've accentuated all of the spirituality, all of the positive. That's what we're trying to say, and that's what Shabbat is supposed to be about. Okay. With that in mind, let's look at the first two excerpts of the Netivot Shalom. The first thing he says is this. Again, this is on the Slonimer Rebbe's writings on Parashat Tzav. So he says first excerpt, and that's the Holy One, blessed be He, gave them the holy temple, as it is written, and they shall build a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. Right? Remember that? Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. It is written within them and not within it. Meaning the holy temple, the power of the holy temple. It's not that, it doesn't say there that God will dwell in it. It says b'tocham, amongst the Jewish people. So by inaugurating the Mishkan, what the priesthood is trying to do here, well, I just went out on Facebook. If you're watching on Facebook, I'm sorry that iPad died. But you're with me, God willing, now on tbam.org/streaming. So there's no sense in telling them anything who's watching on Facebook. It's off. Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure how I could have let that happen. But I did. What are you going to do? If you've self-nullified, and now you're spiritual, and you've had the 7-day period. So what the Torah is saying is, when the priesthood goes into the Mishkan, the purpose of having the Mishkan is not to bring God's presence into the Mishkan. That's not what it says. It says, betocham, amongst the Jewish people. So the goal of the priests, listen closely here, the goal of the priests is to inaugurate the Mishkan, inaugurate the tabernacle, so that God, through the tabernacle, can shoot out His holiness to all of the Jews. So what the priests are doing, it's like they're setting up this laser beam that once it's set up, through that, God's presence can go out and hit all of the Jews. That's what they're trying to do. But if they don't set it up the right way, then God's not going to be able to shoot out His holiness to each one of us. Okay, so this is what the Netivot Shalom says in the first source here. Look what he says. That the holy temple brings holiness into each individual wherever they are. So the fact that the holy temple exists, or in the wilderness the Mishkan exists, once the priests get that thing set up, all the other Jews can experience God's holiness. And they need to quarantine themselves to make sure that they have nullified themselves to allow this process to happen. Okay, that's the first excerpt. The second excerpt that the Nesivos Shalom then says is this. And he commanded them, and from the opening of the tent of meeting, do not go out for 7 days, because the tent of meeting is the source of holiness. This is what the Slonim Rebbe says. Slonim Rebbe is telling you that if you mess this up, if you don't sequester for 7 days, and you don't get this done, then it's as if you're dead. Because you have this chance to sanctify the Mishkan so that God can communicate with the Jewish people. And if you don't do that because you went out during those 7 days and you became impure, not so much that you stepped on a snake or that you touched a woman in her impurity. That's not what it means. What it means is if you go out during that 7-day period and you're not self-nullified, you may walk among the people and say, hey, I'm the high priest, I'm something pretty special, or I'm in the priesthood, I'm a big deal. And you've now gone away from that self-nullification that you're supposed to have, and you start being arrogant or being greedy, then you're going to cause harm to everybody else, because when you come back to inaugurate the Mishkan, you're not going to be pure enough to inaugurate it and to allow God to reach everybody else. So you're going to mess it up, and that's why you need to be sequestered for 7 days. Okay, what this means for us. Now, we can talk about this for the coronavirus and talk about why do we need to sequester, because if we go out, we could hurt other people. I mean, it's uncanny that that's this week's Torah portion. That going out and seeing ourselves as more important than we are, right? That especially me, I need to go out. Well, then you're putting other people at risk. And this is the exact same thing that the high priests were doing. So let's hold on to that for 1 second. But let's think about this every week. If you stay home all week, if you just stay in your house all week, there's no chance you're going to hurt anybody else. If you stay home all week, and you don't have contact. I mean, this was, these ideas that the Slonim Rebbe was before FaceTime and stuff like that. But if you don't have contact with anyone else over the course of the week, you can't hurt anybody else over the course of the week. If you don't talk to anybody, you're not going to gossip, right? If you don't go out into the world, you're not going to feel greedy. You're not going to, one of the things that's different about what's going on right now, we don't care so much how we look. I mean, I do, because I've become, a bigger TV star than I was before this. That's the opposite of self-nullification. It's been very tough for me. But, we don't care how we look. Usually I wear nicer clothes to this class. Although this is a shirt that I got for my birthday from Adrian Messing. So this is a pretty nice shirt. But forget the shirt. If we don't go out, we can't hurt the world. And so staying home means that we can't hurt anybody. I'm not talking about just during the coronavirus. I'm talking about all the time. Okay, fine. So if we stay home, we can't hurt anybody. However, it's not practical. We need community. We need each other. So what does that mean? What does that mean? We need to spend at least one day during that week where we self-nullify, where we rest, where we stop everything, where we have that Erev Shabbat moment where we move from the craziness of the world that we live into and move into this moment where we self-nullify and come back and say, look, the world doesn't revolve around me. Because if we can do that every week, then when Shabbat's over and we go back out into the world, hopefully it'll stick with us. The idea of Shabbat is that one Shabbat is supposed to lead into the other. It says in the Talmud, in the tractate of Psachim, that if you take some of your wine for Havdalah, and you save a drip of wine from Havdalah on Saturday night, and you pour it into your cup Friday night when you begin the next Shabbat. So you carry the end of one Shabbat into the beginning of the next Shabbat. People who do that go straight to heaven when they die. Now, I don't know if they necessarily go straight to heaven, but the point of what the Talmud is saying is, it's people who do that, it's like you're celebrating Shabbat all week. So what does it mean? How do you celebrate Shabbat all week? That doesn't mean that you don't use electricity all week and that you make tuchalas every day. No, what it means is that you self-nullify on Shabbat, and you carry that concept with you throughout the week. And so throughout the week, you then are able to go through the world and be self-nullified so that you don't hurt other people with your own arrogance. And if you're able to do that, you'll go out into the world, you're not going to hurt other people. So the whole idea here, let's just sum this up very quickly. The whole idea of the rabbis, the Slonimer Rebbe, the Torah, the priesthood sequestering themselves for 7 days here, but also before Yom Kippur, also before offering the red heifer, all of these ideas are to pass through one Shabbat, just like for a bris, so that it's done on the 8th day because you had 7 days. And if you have that experience of Shabbat, like hopefully we're all having today, where you self-nullify, where you rest, where you start to look at what's truly important in the world, then when you go out into the world, you're not going to hurt anybody. So I think the coronavirus is a reset. It's an opportunity for us all to have this sequestering, to have this quarantine. We'll see how long it lasts. But if we take advantage of it, we can use it as an opportunity to reset. Physically, if we don't go out of our homes, we're not going to hurt anybody else. But if there's one lesson we can learn from this whole experience, is that now physically we need to be very cognizant, and we all are, not to go out of our homes because we might hurt somebody else and get them sick. But when this is all over and we go back to being out in the world, we need to remember that we can't go out into the world on a day-to-day basis and cause harm to other people through our own arrogance, our own greed, through any of the sins that we bring into the world. If you're home, if you're sequestered, you can't hurt other people. That's what we're doing right now. But soon we're going to need to go back into the world. When we go back into the world, well, let's remember that Shabbat is that one day that we sequester to remind ourselves not to go out in the world and cause harm through our sins. That's why the end of this week's Torah portion is, don't go out of the tent of meeting for a 7-day period. Because if you do, you're going to hurt everybody else. You're going to take away from their holiness. You're going to cause the Mishkan not to work. And you're going to cause a blockage between the connection of God to the other people. When we bring our own sins into the lives of other people, we do the exact same thing. So there's a really valuable lesson here. I think it's uncanny that it appears in this week's Torah portion while we're going through this, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't learn this lesson, that we're not leaving our homes now because we don't want to hurt anybody, but our sins hurt people all the time when we go out. Let's not go out of our homes and hurt anybody, even once this quarantine is over and the coronavirus fear is no longer among us. I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. I really appreciate that you join us. There are a lot of people with us this morning, and it's very much appreciated. I want to remind you that Minyan begins on this channel at 10:30. Havdalah with Cantor Nelson is tonight at 7:30. We've got all of our Seders and all the information for the virtual Seders on our website, tbam.org/calendar. And also tbam.org/coronavirus, where you can find all of the up-to-date information. I got a huge week on the show this week, so tune in. I'll be back Monday live at noon. I'm off tomorrow in terms of broadcasting, but live at noon with Rabbi Barras picks up again on Monday, and we got a lot of great stuff happening this week. I hope to see you. Wish everybody a very happy Shabbos. Be well, stay safe. Shabbat Shalom.